Excuse me. All right. Well, welcome back. This is going to be moving into, previously in module 1.1, we talked about ecosystems and what drives those ecosystems and sort of the components of that. So we've got niches and competition, and we have plants that are trying to survive, and they require certain climate factors in order to survive, primarily light. Plants require light, and another important factor for growth is temperature. And so the plant populations in South Dakota are going to be much different from the plant populations in Tennessee. I want to talk a little bit about how each one of those influence what plants grow and how fast they grow and where they grow. So some of the learning outcomes, we'll talk about solar radiation, altitude and latitude, which change a lot of things because as we are, our altitude being how high we are in relative to sea level. And so that would mean that we're closer to the sun, technically. And then the latitude is sort of where at on Earth's curved surface are we in relation to the equator? And cloud cover is going to affect that as well. So that leads us into light intensity and how much light is needed in order to influence that plant growth. And so light is actually the trigger or the cue that tells plants, hey, it's time for me to do a certain function, whether it be to, no different than humans, and that it's time for us to wake up, or it is time for us to move into flowering because the growth season is about to end. And then finally, temperature. And temperature is important. It is one of the primary driving factors for biomass growth, not necessarily the plant growth stages. And when I talk about growth stages, we can think about this in terms of humans, in that as we're children, and then somewhere around high school, we grow into adults capable of reproducing. Puberty, so to speak, right? So, and then after that, we start moving into our 20s and 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, and at some point, we're starting to get to the end of that growth curve. And so, light is the cue for the vegetative and reproductive phases based on temperature, because when the light increases, if you have a lot of light, it is likely to be summertime, depending on where you are in relation to the equator, right? So for us in America, north of the equator, during the summer, we have the longest days. And therefore, we would suspect that we have the greatest temperature. It's summertime. However, as we start to move to shorter days, the temperature is cooler. And so plants use the light and the temperature in order to cue when they're supposed to do certain things. So there's 4 or 5-ish main factors about, that are going to affect plant growth. We've got light. So not only the intensity of light, but the length of light. We call that photoperiod. Next, we have gases, because remember that plants breathe in, correct, carbon dioxide, and they breathe out oxygen. So we breathe in oxygen or breathe out carbon dioxide, and we have this sort of symbiosis with that. Temperature is important, as I just mentioned. Whether it be too hot or too cold, that plant will not respond well to that. And so I want you to think about this in terms of maybe a chemical reaction. Let's think about water, that when you heat water up, it becomes like the molecules move very rapidly. And so there is a lot of expenditure of energy. But when the water is cold, it is frozen and those molecules are very still. And so we have the same thing with our plants, and that temperature is required for those biochemical reactions to grow the plant. That is the biomass part. So the light and the gas are going to provide the food source. The temperature is going to be the driving factor of that. And then we need water as well. Most living organisms need water, much like humans. And then sort of underneath that, we have soil, and that has to do with the pH, and that's going to deal with the nutrients. But for the main part, we're looking at light, gases, water, and temperature. Those are the 4 main factors that drive plant growth, because we can grow plants without soil, but you are not going to be able to grow plants without temperature, unless it's a cool season plant, right? But we've got to influence the temperature somewhat. You're not going to grow plants without water. You are not going to grow plants without carbon dioxide. You're not going to grow plants unless there's light, because that's part of the photosynthetic equation. These three right here are part of the photosynthesis equation. So we have those biomes, and that's going to be that collection of ecosystems. So ecosystems just being a one single sort of microbiome, this one pocket. If you think about Tennessee, there are different cities across the entire state, each one of those cities being a different ecosystem that is part of the biome that makes up Tennessee. And so, because the biome is similar, or the plants that grow inside of that biome require similar climate conditions, those are the types that you would likely find if the climate were consistent across. Generally, it's a latitude. If you are likely to find the same plants along the same parallel generally, because the temperature is going to be about the same with, let's say, the changes in elevation. So let's draw a line from North Carolina over to Kansas. In general, most of the plants that grow along that parallel require those climatic conditions because they exist only at that parallel. If you were to move north or south of that imaginary line that we drew, then things are going to change a little bit. Okay, so biomes, that's mostly going to be made up of climate, and actually the soil is going to be the main influence of that climate. It's going to have some major impact on that because it's going to influence how many plants or what types of plants can grow there. So, soil is produced from this parent material, some sort of bedrock, some sort of, when we think about that volcanoes explode and they give off that, the lava comes out, it cools, it forms a rock that has to break down. When that rock breaks down, that makes the soil. And if the soil is not conducive for certain types of plants, those plants won't grow there. They just can't. So, not only do you have temperature and light and water, but you also have like soil types. And if the soil type is not conducive for that plant to grow, let's say, for instance, corn. Corn does not like very heavy clay soils. So you're not going to grow corn very well, let's say, in East Tennessee, because the soil type is different. But we grow corn really well out in West Tennessee because the soils are more sandy. So that plays a major role in that as well. So temperature and precipitation are going to be influenced by latitude and altitude, two of these together. I don't think we need to put anything in here with the systems. I hope there's nothing in your notes that you have to fill in with the systems. I'm not expecting you to be meteorologists and know these different Hadley systems or a Ferrel or polar, but I am expecting you to understand the concept that latitude, where we are in relation to the equator, is going to influence, and altitude is going to influence what sort of plants grow there. All right, so we have four different sort of general ecosystems that we're thinking about. We've got savannas, and this is generally going to be what we have here in the United States. In general, it's not a hardcore concrete that everything in the United States is a savanna. But in general, if you're above 30 degrees north, you're likely to have savannas. If you're along the equator, well, let's think about the Amazon rainforest, you're likely to have a tropical rainforest biome. Because there's a lot of heat and a lot of water, and temperature and water drive plant growth. So then next we have deserts. And if you think about this, well, maybe again, it's not a perfect thing, but we do know that the Sahara Desert, being over here in Africa, not a lot of rainfall, a lot of temperature, but no plants are growing. And then we have the tundras that kind of at the tops and the bottoms of the whole entire Earth. And so as we start to move up into Canada, we start getting into the Yukon Territory, we start getting up here into, maybe Iceland and Greenland, the Arctic Circle, we got Antarctica. Those are known as the tundra, the frozen tundra. And the plant life there is very little because there's no temperature and most of the water is not available. There's water there, it's just frozen. So we look at our biome period or our biome pyramid that as we are hot and we have a lot of water, we're going to have a rainforest sort of micro or biome. But if we don't have water, it's going to be dry. And we're maybe getting into, Arizona, where only a certain types of plants are adapted to grow to that. And so then that as we start to move more north, and we start getting into Canada, they have the boreal forest, and then finally the tundra, which is the polar region. And there's not a lot going on there, is it? It's not a place where many people would like to live. So we've got the equator. Many of us are aware that this is this imaginary line that is drawn around the center of the Earth. It is sort of the starting point for any of our latitudes, whether that be north or south. And many of us are aware that as we get north, we have our summer times during June and July, April, May, June, and July. But below that, their summertime is actually when our winter is because of the tilt of the earth. And we'll look at that in just a moment. So because that temperature and they have a lot of water, because heat is actually going to drive our rainfall. It's actually going to drive the weather patterns that give us the rainfall. And I'll probably talk about this more in classes, that the hotter the environment, like the hotter the atmosphere, the more water it can hold. And so if you have a lot of water in this hot atmosphere, at some point, that water will cool and fall on the earth. So that's why our tropical rainforests are the most productive biomes, because they have the highest temperature closest to the equator, but they also get the most rainfall because that atmosphere can hold on to that moisture that is evaporated off of the oceans or the lakes or the rivers, streams, and whatnot. So all of our components of weather and climate, we've got sunlight, temperature, and water. We have humidity, there's going to be wind movement, and then the atmosphere, what sort of gases are available for that plant um, to conduct photosynthesis and function properly and get rid of that water, all play a part into how we increase this yield. And so because we know where the plants are going to grow, we start to change our planting date so that we get the most radiation, likely to have the greatest temperature, and hopefully we generally do this around planting dates for our rainfall. And we're going to have to start shifting that as our climate starts to, migrate or change, or however you want to hear that. We're going to need to shift our planting dates and come up with different varieties that are adapted to these changing conditions. The humidity and the wind movement and the atmosphere, those are going to stay pretty stable. But we're starting to get some changes in our temperature and our precipitation that are causing issues. So as mentioned before, this is mostly going to be driven by solar radiation. We get the biggest changes in climate, the different fluctuations in climate based on solar radiation. And so many of us are aware that somewhere around April and May, as the atmosphere is changing from cold to hot, and we start getting these mixtures, that's a really bad time. Bad, I'm doing my air quotes. It's a really bad time for the potential for tornadoes because of the change and the mixing of that hot and cold air. That makes the environment very unstable. So our latitude and altitude are going to influence that, and that's ultimately going to influence which vegetation is present, which is also going to influence the climate. So not only is climate influencing the vegetation, the plants that grow there, those plants that grow there have some small influence on the climate, on how much water they're going to take up. If I want you to think about what would happen if you cut down all of the trees in your yard, that would change the microclimate that is present. So things like mountains and valleys, how much water is around, oceans and lakes, streams, creeks, whatever, are going to influence how much water makes it into the atmosphere. And then we have some smaller things that are going to influence our microclimate. And so these might be, again, your smaller lakes, your smaller creeks, the changes in topography. If there's any buildings around, like that actually changes a lot of why we can't grow plants in, urban areas. Just think about downtown Nashville. I want you to think about all the buildings that are there. The climate inside of that little downtown Nashville area is much warmer than it is outside of it, because that concrete is actually absorbing a lot of that heat and also giving off a lot of that heat. So that doesn't make it very good for trees and plants to grow there. Like those are actually very warm environments. So our latitude is going to dictate our solar radiation. And we've discussed that solar radiation influences climate. Climate is actually going to influence the soil formation. And then that soil formation is going to influence what type of vegetation grows there, which we've talked about, that vegetation is going to influence that climate. So the tilt of the Earth's axis gives us our seasons and how close we are in relation to the sun, which changes the intensity of the solar radiation. And if it is warmer, we're likely to have greater populations, because in general, most of us don't want to live in the cold. And if you think about cold environments, there's not a lot of like wildlife and microbial populations or insects, because the weather's not conducive for them. The climate isn't conducive for them either. Next, we have the radiation, and this radiation is important for how our plants and what light forms that our plants actually absorb. So, many of us are aware the rainbow, Roy G. Biv, and there are different wavelengths of light that plants take in that are going to help them grow. So, in general, what we call this photosynthetically active radiation, or PAR, photosynthetically active radiation, is somewhere between 400 and 700 nanometers. And we can see this here. This is more of our black light. But look, we start getting our blues, and our greens, and our yellows, and reds. Or actually go the other way, right? Red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, violet. And so plants have chlorophylls, different types of chlorophylls and different pigments, and we'll talk about this probably in module 3. They have these different pigments that absorb that light, and that light contains energy. That energy is what actually drives the photosynthesis process. Again, a module 3 discussion, but I'm setting that up, that the wavelengths of light and what those plants actually absorb are going to influence photosynthesis. It's right there, photosynthesis. So somewhere between 400 and 700 is where we're going to get the majority of our information, the majority of our energy. Now, there are some wavelengths way out here that we can't see, that plants are still exposed to, but they actually reflect those. Also, the type of light and what the along that visible spectrum and what the wavelengths are. So generally, when we have somewhere between 400 and 500 nanometers, that light is not very active. Like the energy inside of that is not very strong, and that is part of our vegetative stage. And anything below 400 is actually harmful to plants. Now, as we start to move later in the season, like in the summertime, a lot of our plants are starting to die off because they know that the temperature is about to change. And The light that is being delivered is also changing, and that's a cue to the plant to say, hey, it's about to not be conducive for you to be alive. You need to reproduce so that your seed can be stored inside of the soil, inside of the seed bank, and we can repopulate next year. Our time is done. We'll see you in the spring. We're about to go into hibernation. We're done. We've completed our life cycle. And so between 620 and 780 on the red end of the spectrum is where we have our flowering period. So our vegetative and flowering stages are this, in the beginning of the year, there's no flowers on those plants. But at some point in time, the flowers start to bloom. They will make seed. Those seed contain the genetic information that is going to create the next generation for the next season. And not only the intensity, but also the wavelength of light gives the plant the cue to say, it's time for you to do something different. So as we start to get more of our infrared, we start getting more on the higher end of this spectrum as the summer starts to increase, more sunlight is being given, and the intensity of that and the type of sunlight is going to tell the plant, hey, it's time for us to start flowering now because there's enough energy in the sunlight that we're receiving to produce enough photosynthates, our carbohydrates, for making seed. So the distance from the equator actually influences the intensity of our light. And so when the Earth is perfectly straight up and down, the majority of the sunlight, hits the equator. And that as we tilt this, and we'll hopefully see this in the next couple slides, that when we tilt towards the sun, this actually tilts away, and this is our summer, and that is their winter. At some point, we tilt this way, we now have winter, and they now have summer. Here it is. So as our Earth tilts, we start getting changes in the amount of light and the time of light that hits our surface. And when that changes, our plants cue into that. Okay, so we have things called the equinox and the solstice. So for the equinox, this is when we have 12 hours of sunlight and 12 hours of nighttime. On two sides, we have one in the spring and then one in the fall. And so we're starting to get closer to September 21st. And the sun is starting to set earlier. We're starting to get equal amounts of daytime and nighttime. Now for the solstice in June, that's when we actually have 16 hours of daylight and 8 hours of nighttime. Now let's fast forward to wintertime. Around Christmas, that's when we actually have 8 hours of daylight and 16 hours of nighttime. Make sense? So the tilt of the Earth's axis influences how much sunlight the Earth receives. And if you don't have enough sunlight, well, then the plants won't grow. They require a certain time or a certain amount of sunlight in order to make enough energy, in order to make enough carbohydrates in order to reproduce. And they've adapted to that over time. So on the equinoxes, the day length is 12 hours. When we get the summer solstice, it's longer during the summertime, and the winter solstice is the shortest. So, and the solstice, we've got 16 hours of daylight, 8 hours of sunlight, or nighttime. In the winter solstice, we have 8 hours of daylight and 16 hours of nighttime. And I want you to think about something as well. I've read in some places there's this correlation between seasonality and I guess what you would call maybe sort of human depression. During the summertime, there's a lot of sunlight, and it is a great time to, yeah, everyone's happy, and we're generally happy, and we're trying to go do things, and we have enough time to do things, and there's enough light. And then as we start to get towards Halloween, you'll start to notice that we are a little bit more run down, and there's not quite enough energy. And as we start to get darker, it's just kind of blah. And then as we start to get into December and January, there's just no motivation to do anything. And then finally, we start to get around March, spring break, and we start to notice that the daylight starts to get a little bit longer. And you know what? We're about to be into April and May, and summer's right around the corner, and all of a sudden our attitudes change. And it has the same thing to do with plants, that as the light starts to decrease, their populations decline. So I generally say this in class, that I want people to be aware that as we start to lose day length, the amount of light, and you start wondering why you're so down. Well, this is probably one of the reasons for that. Like, there's some strong studies and correlated between the seasons and just overall mental health. And we're worn down from the year, and we're ready for it to be over, and we're going to start a new year, and new year, new me, and all this stuff. And so we have the same thing with our plants. So our day length, we have, or what we will call photoperiod, is going to influence how much radiation that we actually receive for photosynthesis. And so the more light that you have, the more food the plant can make. The more food the plant can make, the bigger it can grow. So we have short day, long day, and day neutral. And what this actually is, I want you to think about, we're actually getting into longer nights. So short day plants, there's a time period where there's only enough energy that's being given. And when that time period changes, those plants get the cue to say, hey, wait a minute, I didn't make enough photosynthesis today. There wasn't enough sunlight for me to complete as much photosynthesis as I would have liked to. Something's happening, something's changing. It's about to not be, it's about to get shorter days. I need to reproduce. And that's the photoperiodic cue that tells the plant when to or when not to start doing something. And so now we have a change in when we go from December starting into March, where as the day length gets longer, plants actually start to grow a little bit more, because the timeline is they're going to get more they're going to get more radiation. So they're like, oh, it's time for me to wake up and start doing something. And then we have some that are day neutral, and these are typically plants that we will grow in a greenhouse, because we don't require, we can actually influence the amount of light that they do or do not receive. And so that really doesn't play a significant role in their growth habit. So that, as I've mentioned several times, that photoperiodic plant reproductive cycle is determined by the day length. And so when that day length starts to change, that sends cues to the plant to do one of two things: either start growing more, or you need to start packing it up because it's about to get cold. Or, as we start to get more daylight, we're likely to get more a temperature increase. And so we're going to be ready to get busy. All right. So when you see me with a star here, this is like one of those slides where, like, you should probably pay attention to, rather than writing down rice, coffee, soybean, tobacco, chrysanthemum, blah, 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 blah. The question is going to be, list a short day plant. Rice. And I'm going to have you write all of these down. Okay. And so, and the same thing with soybean, which soybean and tobacco we grow in Tennessee, that as that day length starts to get shorter, the plants flower, they put out their seed, because they know that it's about to be time for them to sort of shut things down. Then we have long day plants. And so these are the plants, when the day length is longer, these are our long day, short nights, so that as our days start to get longer, that's when they're actually going to start flowering. And so these are going to be things like barley, our spinach, lettuce. These might be things that we grow in a garden. So it's a little bit backwards. Our long day plants require short nights, and our short day plants require long nights. Short day, long night. Long day, short night. And then we have day neutral. And so, as I mentioned, these are something that we might grow in a greenhouse, like tomatoes. Corn and cotton we grow in the summertime because they're more temperature dependent. That's a really good example of where the light doesn't necessarily impact the growth habit. It is the temperature that influences that. So our temperature is going to be huge in that is going to help us, grow and sort of thrive. And when we have greater temperatures, we're likely to have more light. And so the environment, the environment is conducive for growing. And so we have these hardiness zones that sort of tell us what plants are going to thrive and where they're going to thrive at. So again, if this plant that grows here in Minnesota is not going to do well in Florida, and this plant that grows in Florida is not going to do well in Minnesota. And this is starting to change because we're having what I like to call climate encroachment. So we'll see this in the next map. Notice the sort of yellowish tan. And then notice this little belt right here is this very light yellow. But now notice where our tan is. You see that? So we're starting to get this climate encroachment. Look at how much blue and purple and sort of cold. Those are my cold colors, right? These are, when you're watching the Weather Channel or something, these are the cold colors. Look how much is there now. And so this is what they're projecting, the change in the hardiness zone. So all of the plants that used to grow here, and I want you to think about, remember that plants are also going to influence the ecosystem and the biome and the climate there. When those plants change, how long is it going to take for new populations to fill in these niches in these climates? And then when we talk about this in soils, there's going to be some changes in soil that are not going to be conducive. Like, while this may look okay, there's going to be some serious problems that are going to occur there. All right, and we have hardiness zones not only in the region, but also in the state. And that is going to be dictated most likely by altitude. And so the question is where is your hardiness zone? Here we are in Putnam. So our hardiness zone somewhere between 6A and 6B, but it changes over here. We are, out in West Tennessee, and we're more 7A to 7B. So it's going to be a challenge to grow a 6B plant in 7B environment. Much like the same, it's going to be hard to grow a 7B in 6B, 6A. Okay. So I've kind of beat this to death. We've got latitude and altitude. Our atmosphere and our ocean currents are influenced by temperature because the water will evaporate, and that gives us sort of our jet stream of where that water moves. So water is going to be, our bodies of water are going to be important for how our temperature is influenced. So we have these things called growing degree days. And in general, for the most part, most of the plants that we tend to grow do very well between 60 and 90. And I guess if you think about this, like, that's a pretty good environment for our humans as well. So every plant has a certain number of growing degree days that are required before they reach certain growth stages. So the changes in the seasonal temperature are going to influence that. So it's not constant. We don't have a constant temperature all the way through. And so the growth rate of our plants are not going to be continuous as well. So we have a minimum, we have an optimum, and then we have the maximum. And so at some point in time, if it gets to be 105 in Tennessee, plant growth stops. Be no different than us. Think about that. If you were working out in 105-degree heat, how much would you be trying to work? How much could you work? But if it's 70, 75, 80, all right, I can keep going. If it gets to be like 60, I'm not moving very fast either. Okay, so there are some things that can be done for temperature manipulation. If we're talking about maybe in a greenhouse situation, are there buildings around that are going to influence that microclimate? Can we put fans on our plants? Or maybe if you're thinking about golf courses, sometimes they have to go around and they have to water the greens in between golfers. All right, so let's get into this growing degree day thing. It's the only math that you'll have to do in this class. Okay. And growing degree day is essentially the average daily temperature minus the base temperature of 50 degrees. So we call this growing degree day 50. And generally, for most plants, we use that growing degree day 50 as the base. Only cotton, and maybe a couple of other ones, maybe sorghum, are going to be based on growing degree day 60. All it is we're going to take the average temperature, the max plus the minimum divided by 2. So max plus the minimum divided by 2, and subtract that 50 from it. So 89 plus 63 gives us 152. Divided by 2 is 76. 76 minus 50 gives us 26 growing degree days, or if you can think about a growing degree day as a heat unit. And you will accumulate these. Think about it like going to work. You're going to work X number of hours and you're going to accumulate X amount of money. You don't give that money back up. That goes on your paycheck. And so at the end of the week, you get your entire paycheck minus taxes. Thank you, Uncle Sam. Okay, so let's work through. I'll give you an opportunity to sort of work through what the growing degree day 50. What we're going to do is we're going to calculate this. We're just going to calculate the means first. Okay, so this would be a good time to pause the video, calculate just the means. All right, so we're unpaused. Our mean is 63. Everyone get about the same means here? And then we're going to subtract 50 from that 63. So 63 minus 50 gives us 13 because we're using growing degree day 50 as our base. Remember, average minus 50. This is our average minus 50. Our average minus 50. Okay. Now, the sort of air quote tricky part is that we're going to accumulate these growing degree days. So we have 13 plus 18 and a half gives us 31.5. 31.5 plus 28.5 gives us 60. It's just like accruing money from your paycheck. Each day that you work, that goes towards your final, paycheck. So calculate the mean, subtract 50, and then start accumulating those days. Such that after 5 days, you've accumulated 127 growing degree days. You cannot lose growing degree days. Once you earn them or the plant receives them, however that needs to sound, you can't go to 100. You've already accumulated 127 growing degree days. And you would do this over the entire growing season. All right, here's another opportunity for you to work through those. If you want, you can pause the video and you can calculate the complete, like go ahead and complete this whole thing. So pause that video. When we come back, we'll walk through this process again and we'll see where you landed. All right, so we're going to calculate the mean. 70 plus 62 divided by 2 gives us 66. Now, here's the tricky part. This one right here, you cannot lose growing degree days. So if you did not make it to 50, you did not accrue any growing degree days. So 66 minus 50 gives us 16. 58 minus 50 gives us 8. 0. You cannot have negative growing degree days. The plant just didn't grow. Nothing happened. No money made. So 16 plus 8, 24. 24 plus 0, still 24. 24 plus 17, 41. 41 plus 22 is 63. That's the amount of growing degree days that accumulated. You cannot lose growing degree days. You cannot have negative growing degree days. They don't exist. You just didn't get any money that day. If you think about it in terms of money, you just didn't get any money. You didn't lose it, but you didn't make it. All right, that's all I have for module 1.2. This should get you to be able to complete the module, quiz 1.2. And then in the next video, we'll sort of go over nutrition. Wait a minute. That's not correct. This is the end of module 1.2.1. We still have climate that we need to do, and that'll be in video 3. Okay? All right. If you got any questions, make sure that you reach out to me. Don't go into the quiz, unknowing. Pretty much if you filled in the blanks, then you should be able to complete the quiz. It's open note. All right. Y'all have a good day.